Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and today we are going to continue in our tactical card series because I don't want to go quite into too many of the tactics videos just yet until I get my models, which ideally is going to be within the next couple of weeks. So I figure tactical cards are something we can definitely talk about and start thinking through, what kind of cards you want to select because that's of course going to determine what kinds of units you can run thanks to how it affects slots. And so today we're going to jump out of the realm of the bio stuff. We've been doing a lot of, the more baseline, basic units, and it might surprise you we're going straight to Goliaths with the Terran. The simple reason for that is because one, I really like Goliaths. They're one of my favorite units ever. It's actually one of the reasons why I don't ladder very often with Terrans on StarCraft 2 because I can't use one of my favorite Terran units. The second reason why is because a lot of you apparently really like Goliaths because a lot of you went and watched the Goliath video. And so if I like Goliaths and you like Goliaths, then I should just give you guys what you want. Very simply. Three, because it is true, we are likely going to have to revisit this video within the next couple of months because when Siege Tanks, Immortals, and Ravagers drop, we are very likely to get a new building or two that affect mechanical Terran units because the Siege Tank is coming out. And we're going to talk about that at the very end of the video as to what I think some of those might potentially be. Because there really aren't a whole lot of ground mech buildings beyond the factory and the armory. But I figure even if it means I have to go back and do an updated video on the top tactical cards for Goliath, worst case scenario, you get more content for units that you like, right? So in that sense, I don't really think it's a big problem. And I figure there will still be something new and interesting to talk about in that video because there will be a legitimate question of, okay, you're building and you're tailoring your plan toward Goliath, but should you also be tailoring it to siege tanks? And so toward that end, we're going to jump into this here. Just know this is probably going to be the first video that we're going to have to, at some point, basically just legacy, for lack of a better term, and point people instead to the new video. But honestly, I'm okay with that because I like Goliath and I don't mind talking about them. So to start off with, what kinds of things should we be doing in terms of picking tactical cards that are going to help Goliath? So first things first, they need to be very effective at shooting, right? They technically do have the ability to stomp on things in close combat. They're not very good at it. It is definitely a lot worse than their shooting capabilities. And so we want to be taking cards that are going to help us to maximize our ability to shoot most efficiently at the enemy while not taking substantial damage in return. Second thing to consider is objective control. The Goliath is one of the best units currently in the game for controlling an objective because it has 2 supply, so you probably have to send multiple units in order to try to beat it on an objective. But in addition to that, it doesn't lose any supply for the purpose of controlling objectives or for your army count for that matter, which is something of a drawback, but still, it exists. Until it suffers its last wound, which when it first came out was closer to like 12 wounds. Now, as of its release, I'm pretty sure we're not going to see a lot of changes on this. It's down to 10. But still, it's at 10. 10 wounds that you have to do past a 4+ armor save on an armor target. So a lot of the cheap stuff you can spam out with surge capabilities don't surge against it, right? That is an extremely difficult unit to shift and remove, especially when if it does a little bit of damage to some of your units, you might go from 2 supply to 1 supply. And now instead of just tying it up on the objective, it's now winning on the objective and you're still chipping away at it, right? So being able to maximize the ability of Goliath to be able to get to objectives and then control those objectives is very important. Resilience is also critical, right? It does have high wounds with a 4+ armor value, which is not bad. It also has no evade save, which means, and because of the fact that it doesn't have a particularly good melee attack, it means that if you can get it in melee damage as well, anything we can do to heal or block wounds is going to be really important because it's going to make sure that those objectives stay ours. And even if the Goliath dies later on down the line, if we've held it for enough turns that we've scored enough off of that objective that it's okay if our opponent has it, we're still going to win the match, then that's good, right? But as much as we can do to kind of keep objectives ours, maintain the firepower that Goliaths provide, because Goliaths can fire 2 to 3 weapon systems every turn. So anything we can do to keep that going and improve their resilience and defense is always going to be a plus positive. Fourth, when we look at supply, again, can't lose supply until all the wounds are gone. So anything we can do in order to maintain that supply is always going to be a positive, which, I mean, past 10 wounds, on average, that's 20 hits. That's a lot of hits that you have to do to a single unit in order to drop its supply at all, right? For Marines, it's 6, right? 6 wounds that you have to do, which is 12 total hits. And that's after a 5 plus armor save, maybe with a 5 plus evade save. The evade save is relatively hard for Marines to get, right? And so when looking at Terran objective controlling units specifically, Marauders are great. Don't get me wrong. We're going to talk more about Marauders later in a future video. Marines in large enough numbers can be really good, but maintaining the numbers is tricky. Goliaths are just going to be a steady, steady hand for you for relatively cheap, far cheaper than a large squad of Marauders is going to be. And they will maintain for a very long period of time. And then finally, another thing to consider is that multiple Goliaths is helpful. They have the target lock ability, and the target lock ability allows you to spend 1 command point to select a unit, and any of your Goliaths that fire at that unit with their autocannons gain the ability to surge against both light and armored targets with a D3 plus 1. So you can surge against anything that is not a hero, because heroes don't have either the light or armored keywords, and thus you can't actually surge against them with any unit. Okay, at least at present. Maybe at some point we'll have a hero hunting style unit that can surge against something with the hero keyword. But at least for now, what that means is there's a substantial reward because you can spend 1 command point to give any number of Goliaths a surge ability that they otherwise don't have on autocannons. Autocannons do not naturally surge, and a really good one at that, for only spending the 1 resource, right? It's not like, for example, Glaive Adepts, where in order to use your increased rate of attacks Glaive bonus, you have to spend 1 CP for every single Adept, right? Trade-off, of course, is you all have to be firing at the same unit, but if the same unit is, oh, I don't know, a Nidus Worm or a Roach Squad or something else like that, something big and durable that's going to take a while to chew through anyway, then it's really not a bad thing. But that means that there's going to be benefits in this list for anything that's going to help you to be able to field more than 1 Goliath, because it can only help if you can take advantage of scaling up in order to remove difficult, tough targets without having to spend dramatic amounts of command points as well, right? It provides you with that economy, which is really good. And so, as we prepare to take a look at these, let's see how we can make our Goliaths better. Start off with when we're looking at the faction ranking and which faction is going to be best. You can take either of the ones that currently exist, Rainers, Raiders, or Terran Armed Forces. When we end up getting Dominion of Man, I'm sure Dominion of Man will also be pretty good for these, because I suspect since Goliaths do a lot of things pretty well, there's almost no way you could have a card that's going to work well for, that's not going to treat Goliaths really well unless it like focuses specifically on bio with everything. But in this case, both of the bonuses from Rainers Raiders are really good. It doesn't give us an elite slot. That's like the one drawback behind this. That being said, it's not like every single card has to, okay? But the first thing you get is you get the rapid reinforcements, which allows you to place a friendly point defense drone unit anywhere on the battlefield. Now, the nice thing about point defense drones is that when an enemy declares an attack, a ranged attack, against a unit that's near the point defense drone, the point defense drone can just basically remove a bunch of hits from the attack, which is really, really nice for Goliath, right? Because again, we're trying to do whatever we can to keep our wounds up as long as possible. And the fact that every single turn we could put this thing out and we're not even having to assign it to a specific Goliath. It just has to be a Goliath that's within range. So it could be out there protecting the Goliath. It could be protecting a second Goliath that's also near. It could be protecting a Marine unit or a medic unit. We're throwing this out there, but it's providing this area of denial against shooting attacks that's going to help to keep the Goliaths around, but also other units around, because your opponent doesn't know what you're going to choose to use the defense drone on until they declare attacks and commit to it, right? And so you can then take a look and say, well, it's only 3 Marines. Who cares? I'll let that one through. That's fine. Goliath can take all that. Worst case scenario, it eats 1 or 2 wounds against the armor. That's fine, right? Or then they could follow up with, say, a large Marauder squad. And you're like, okay, well, the large Marauder squad, well, I definitely want to stop that, right? But until such time as you use the point defense drone, your opponent is playing this psychological game where they're trying to figure out, okay, when is he going to use this? What is he going to use to block against? Which units are most important to him? And so this is a really useful thing. If for no other reason, then it's causing a lot more effort from the opponent to try to get anything against anything, but certainly against a Goliath. And all of that is excellent. But where it's particularly useful is the ready for pickup ability, right? In general, Terrans don't actually get to place rule very often right now at all. Even the dropship doesn't have the place ability, it has the ability to place a token, but it doesn't allow you to perform a place action in the movement phase. And this one's not just a place action, fitting for the fact that it's only once per game. It's a place 12, which admittedly is only 12 inches of movement for a Goliath because you don't have any extra models in the army, in that specific unit, right? And so because of that, it's not like you're getting extra movement due to how you reposition the units within coherency. But what this means is if your opponent's trying to screen you out of an objective, and with an 80 millimeter base, that is relatively easy to do against a Goliath. If you want to be able to get to an objective, you might have to go the really long way around. You might have to charge into combat, which is not great for Goliaths, definitely by comparison to shooting at things. But with Ready for Pickup, once per game, you can just pick it up, jump over all of those units, and then place it. Boom. They're within 12 inches, ideally within range of the objective. And if you do that, now it's going to be a whole lot harder to shift you out of there, right? Because now they got to actually remove the model, which is not particularly easy to do. So, in my estimation, while Terran Armed Forces is good, and it is especially good against melee units because you want to be able to, for example, get your, be able to get away from the enemy, or be able to just choose to say we're going first in the movement phase. So that way you can better redeploy and get your Goliaths in a position where you want them to go. While that is useful, I think in general, Rainer's Raiders is going to be protecting you from bigger threats, right? The biggest issue that Goliaths have is that they have 3 weapon systems they can potentially use. Obviously, once we get air units, you'll definitely be able to use all of them potentially. If you take upgrades, which does admittedly make the Goliath a good bit more expensive, then you can use your anti-air missiles against ground targets in different ways, depending on which upgrade you take. The biggest issue, though, is that your underbelly machine gun has a pretty short range at like 8 inches, and your autocannons only have a range of 12, which means if you're facing opponents that have longer range than you, getting hit from those from far away can be a really big problem, unless you have a point defense drone to help to make sure that you aren't actually suffering nearly as much from longer ranges as people would otherwise want. So now they got to engage you with closer range assets, and if that's the case, well, now they're coming into range of the Goliath. Whether that's a melee unit, whether that's a ranged unit that has a shorter range, like a Roach or a Marine or something like that, all of those are going to have to get within range of the Goliath. And the Goliath can now shoot back, all of which is positive. In addition, being able to just maneuver over with an 80 millimeter base, I just can't stress this enough, that is extremely difficult to do. And you tell yourself, well, you just kind of maneuver around it, it'll take you 2 turns to get around it. That's true if there are no, size 3 or other sort of, blocking terrain that would block the Goliath from moving into those places. And those are coming, right? I mean, like, we actually know that raised areas, size 4 terrain, stuff like that is coming within the next couple months. So even if right now you're walking over walls and everything seems fine, just know I don't know that those days are going to last forever. And I certainly don't think it's going to last for too much longer. And so because of that, the ability to just be able to pick up admittedly 1 Goliath for the entire game, but still 1 Goliath could be the difference between winning and losing. And so in my opinion, while you can't really go wrong with either ones you're taking, and admittedly Terran Armed Forces does give you an elite slot, doesn't give you a hero slot, but more on that a little bit later. I would personally lean into Rainer's Raiders instead. I think it's probably a better choice. The truth is, it's kind of be 6 of one if doesn't of another, because a lot of the upgrade cards we're about to talk about are going to cover over some of these problems. I just tend to find that Rainer's Raiders is a little more efficient in some respects. And so I'm on a coin flip, I'm going to go with Rainer instead. So in looking at an honorable mention, there is something we should probably talk about before we get into this, which is the Academy. The Academy doesn't technically help Goliaths at all. In fact, right now it only helps support units, which means it only helps medics. However, medics are extremely useful for Goliaths. Which sounds weird because you're like, well, but Centaur, Life Support, and Medpack both require it to be a biological unit for them to heal. That is true. That is what they require. However, they have another ability that a lot of the people in the online gaming that we've seen, especially for people who are kind of introducing the game to people, because they got early edition sets before all the rest of us got ours. One of the abilities you don't actually see used very often in those playthroughs is the optical flare. An optical flare costs 2 CPs, which is a lot. However, what it does is it allows them to target a unit that's within 12 inches, possibly longer if you end up getting the upgrade. And it says to that unit that their range is reduced by 4 inches. And in addition to that, they can't use long range, which is actually a pretty dramatic bonus because it means that, for example, a unit of roaches that's 8 inches away, that planned on being 8 inches away from a Goliath unit because they wanted to leave room for Zerglings to be able to get around them in order to be able to fill in and be able to attack. If you hit them with flare, now suddenly they're going to be out of range. They aren't going to be shooting at all. And anything we can do to reduce the amount of shooting going against our Goliaths is going to be advantageous because it's going to keep those wounds around a lot longer, right? In addition to that, though, and this is the other big thing, is it forces units that have a pretty long range, like Hydralisks, for example, that might have been planning on sitting back at 16 inches away, down the line could be efficient against something like a siege tank, which might need to siege up in the movement phase and may not be able to unsiege, move, and resiege in the assault phase. It means that if they had been planning on shooting from a further distance and possibly using a long range ability in order to hit you from really far away, because there's nothing saying long range just has to be an extra 4 inches. It could be something that Siege Tank Gun gives it that allows it to fire up to, say, 24, possibly even 30 inches, right? Or something like that, something really insane and crazy. In as much as that's the case, being able to say you can't use long range might mean that a siege tank that thought it was going to have the opportunity to shoot at you might not be within range to shoot at you. And if that's the case, that is huge for the survival of Goliath. So, to be honest, it depends, right? If somebody's doing a massive Zergling run by sort of army, if they're doing a Zealot rush or something else like that, this could be a non issue, right? Down the line, if people are leaning heavily into Ultralisks, this could be a non-issue. It's not going to help Goliaths at all. However, in the interim, where shooting is relatively common, and where people are probably not wanting to get really in close and missing some of the benefit of taking advantage of the longer range that some units have, this could be the difference between getting hit and not getting hit at all, which is dramatic. It's just a little bit difficult for me to gauge because it also means you now have to have medics that are near your Goliaths. And did you choose to, maneuver the Goliath by itself because it has a good amount of supply? How many units do you even have in your army? Because we're not necessarily gearing all of this towards standard level play. It could be skirmish level play. It could be grand campaign, grand army style play. Because of the fact that we aren't setting that in advance, I'm just throwing this at the wall and saying honorable mention because it just covers bases. And we'll see how well this holds up as more things that help mechanical units come down the line. And so with all of that caveat into it, starting at number 5, we have the Orbital Command. Orbital Command is a fantastic upgrade. Let's be clear, okay? It will not be at the bottom for everything. But in this particular case, it has a couple things that hold it back from being like the top thing for helping out Goliath. First of all, it is useful because it does allow you to prevent people from coming in from another table edge other than standard deployment zones, which is really, really nice because it helps to prevent some of those shenanigans, right? It keeps you from being flanked by proxy gateways, Zergling Zerg 6 pools, proxy barracks, things like that, which is really nice for Goliath because you kind of want to know where the enemy is, be able to line up your shots, and then just be able to punch away. You really don't want Zergling coming right at you and taking you in close combat on a turn where you had been planning on shooting out at other stuff, right? And so all of that is a positive. Scanner sweep is also nice because, again, it keeps you from kind of losing shots due to hidden shenanigans, right? So if the opponent ends up burrowing a unit, especially after you've already maneuvered through something like, say, the Swift Burrowing ability from the Zerg Swarm faction card, so, it doesn't have to be the active unit. The active unit you thought might be perfectly vulnerable to fire and then suddenly becomes not vulnerable. Well, in Orbital Command, showing you the area and revealing all the hidden units is going to be helpful for making sure you get to take advantage of stuff, especially if you already declared target lock against the unit, right? Because if you spent some CP already to target lock something, and then they burrow it so you wouldn't be able to shoot at it in the assault phase, that could be problematic for multiple Goliaths, right? And it's already cost you something, which is bad. The biggest issue, of course, with this is that it is highly situational, right? If an army isn't using certain things, if they aren't using a proxy gateway, if they aren't using a proxy barracks, then like preventing them from coming in off of a non-entry edge isn't really a benefit. Scanner sweep, if they don't go hidden very often, it may not make a big difference, right? Terran right now don't have a lot of hidden stuff. We're not likely to see ghosts this year, so because well, maybe Nova. right? If we end up seeing Nova, which sounds like we very well possibly might, then we very well may have at least one hidden model, but do you need orbital command to potentially reveal one hidden model, right? Like, I feel like there are alternatives that could be really advantageous here, that might get you more value reliably than orbital command. That being said, I tend to take one of these if I have 25 left over, just because I think I'd rather have it than not have it, right, in a given situation. But I'm not sure it's entirely the best for Goliath specifically. It might be good for your army in general. Number four, and this might surprise you, is the armory, right? This is one of the few ones that actually helps mechanical units. There's only two of them, but this is one of them, and it gives you bonuses that are, again, very similar to things we've seen for other armies as well. First of all, a friendly mechanical unit gains tough one before it makes an armor roll, which means you get to block one hit. Is nice, is useful. One, because it's a reaction, and you don't have a lot of reactions like Goliaths are doing anyway, so it's not like it's competing against anything else. Two, if you block a hit, it blocks a hit, especially if that hit would do 2 damage instead of 1. This could be a really, really big deal. So in that sense, again, I'm not trying to knock it in terms of this, but I'm just saying it is only tough 1, right? You're blocking 1 wound, potentially, maybe 2, because you're going to make 1 hit into a miss, right? The second bonus that it gives is it allows the mechanical unit on its first ranged weapon to gain critical hit 1. If it was giving critical hit 1 to all of the Goliath weapons, this would be number 1. Okay. It might be a controversial take. Let me know in the comments below if you disagree. But in my opinion, I think this is a helpful thing. Being able to bypass armor in any way is always nice. Being able to do it in a way that is not surge is also really nice, right? Because you don't always surge against everything that you're shooting at. So having an option to be able to say, well, I would really like to just skip the armor roll on a given wound and just move it straight into the wound pile, that would be really nice. And unless they have dodge, they won't be able to reverse that, right? There's no Uno reverse on that. The biggest issue that I have with this is that while there is an improvement to your offense through critical hit 1, since this is a +1 command point card, is it better to give yourself critical hit 1, or is it better to give yourself surge against everything that's not a hero with D3 +1 hits on an autocannon that's shooting like 9 shots? In my mind, that's better. And when you factor in the fact that I can tap that 1 CP to potentially give multiple Goliaths that surge bonus, I think that that is better. So in my mind, it's a fine upgrade to have, but technically, I could get just as much value offensively from a 25 Vespene gas barracks, which is cheaper than an armory. Right. I don't technically need the armory in order to get that bonus. Now, that being said, it does have an elite slot, so it does move you closer to being able to field another Goliath, right? On its own, it doesn't field a Goliath. More on that a little bit later. But it does mean that if you're taking another card that gives you 1 elite slot, right? Let's say that you went with Terran Armed Forces for a faction card, or you end up taking, I think Supply Depot also gives you an elite slot. If you end up taking something like that, meeting that magical number 2 and moving you to an even number is always positive. So in that sense, there is a good reason to take an armory, and it is non-unique, so you can take more than one of these. I'm not saying that one should take more than one of these because they are relatively expensive from a Vespene gas perspective for what you're getting to help Goliaths. But it does technically, it is something you can actually spam out multiples of. So if you like these bonuses, you can actually get it multiple times per turn, which is a useful thing. At number 3, we have the dropship. This is useful not so much because of slots, but because it gives you that maneuverability that you would otherwise want, right? Strap-in does allow you to be able to place in reserves instead of performing an action, which means that if you've cleared one side of the battlefield and you can just park a medic squad, for example, or a small marine squad on an objective and you don't really need a Goliath to be pushing over there anymore, being able to pull them back into reserves and then on the following turn deploy them on the complete opposite side of the board is extremely useful, right? And more on this when we get to the very end of the video when we talk about future potential cards coming out. I think dropship is going to become even more powerful once the siege tank and or the Hellion or the Vulture or any number of other things come out, if they end up giving us these cards that I think they're going to end up giving us in the future. More on that a little bit later. So strap in on its own is going to be really good, but especially for a unit that has a large base, a reasonable 7-inch move. It's kind of like being a speed 4 unit that gets a 3-inch unit coherency is what that speed 7 effectively comes out to. So like it looks fast by comparison on paper to other cards, but it's really not actually. It's really not, at least not for Terran, right? It's not a particularly fast unit. And so because of that, on its own, that many was already going to make the list. Not only because it helps Goliaths, but because it is a really, really good help to Goliaths. But in addition, you get ready for dust off. And ready for dust off means that you can place a faction indicator really far out, and then at the end of the round, you can just deploy a ground unit there. Well, if that allows you to deploy them within range of an objective that's really far away, suddenly you have a 2 supply unit that is quite durable, so it doesn't need a lot of help, that can be off on its own over on another side of the board, and now for the next turn it begins lighting up and shooting. And furthermore, while it does have to be deployed beyond 10 inches of an enemy model, if you do this as your first movement phase action, right, with it, as you're activating some medic unit or some marine unit or whatever, bringing them onto the board, and then you place this faction token here, and then your plan is to drop a Goliath there. If the opponent doesn't have any models on the board, or if they've only brought in one model elsewhere, one unit elsewhere, you have free reign to place it as close to that objective as you want, right? And it's not canceled by your opponent moving things into the area afterwards. You're just going to get to drop it off. And then end of round. It happens at the end of the round. So then new phase, they won't have a chance to do anything about it until the next turn is up and running, right? There's nothing they can do to it. They can't put wounds on it. They can't do anything like that. All of which is possible. The only drawback that you really get from this, and we talked about this again kind of in the last the last video when we were talking about Marines, is that it means it's going to take 2 turns to redeploy with strap-in. That's like the one big issue. And this becomes an issue, and it kind of gets thrown in stark relief if you are running Raiders, because admittedly it's only, again, once per game, but you may only need it once per game. A place 12 action means you can do that in the move phase, and you still could shoot in the assault phase. Strap in means since you're doing this instead of performing an action, you weren't even doing anything else for the turn other than being pulled into reserves. And then you're still in reserves for the assault phase because as far as I can tell, the deploy action is a movement phase only action. It is the move action can be done in the assault phase, can be done in the move phase, but the deploy action, which is what moves you on through a table edge, is only a movement phase. So now you're missing out on the first assault phase, right? On the same turn that you're using strap in. You're missing out on close combat phase. That's actually probably to your advantage, to be honest. And then you get to move in again on the next movement phase, right? So you're losing a lot of time, which is part of the reason why dropship is not going to be number 1. Okay. It is still advantageous. It is still good. I do highly recommend that you still run it. And it gives you some of that support bonus and abilities that you would want. You could definitely run enough medics to help you out with things like optical flare if you need to, because of the fact that it's giving you extra support slots. But in general, I don't think it's enough to crack the top 2. And at number 2, we have the factory, which also might be surprising, okay? Because this one, I'm going to be honest, I had it at number 1 for a little bit. I did end up moving down to number 2 at the very, very end, about 6 minutes before recording this video. It gives you a simple ability. It gives you field repair. It allows an active mechanical unit to heal 2, which is really nice because you don't have any other ways to heal, and I don't think we're going to get SCVs at any point in the future. So toward that end, being able to have a way to recover wounds on something that's already really durable, that already has a lot of supply, that is already causing a headache for your opponent, is phenomenally good. But even then, that's not where all of the bonuses of this card end. First of all, it gives you 2 elite slots, which is equal to 1 Goliath. So as many factories as you run, you can run that many Goliaths, which is really good, right? It's a shame. This is a relatively expensive Vespene Gas card, so it's not like you can spam out as many of these as you could say the normal standard barracks, for example. That being said, it is non-unique. So you can run more than one of these. You can run, depending on your points level, obviously, 3 or 4 of these. And that gives you the freedom to be able to say, regardless of your other tactical cards, regardless of whether or not your faction card includes elite or not, you can run 3 or 4 Goliaths now in your list. And so if you're planning on doing something like Terran Mech, for example, you can do Terran Mech with a multitude of factories. It does work. I don't think you could do like 100% mech currently using only, like only mech units. Simple reason being, I just don't think you're going to be able to fill the points with Goliaths. Once we get siege tanks, who knows? Maybe you will be able to. But at least at present, I'm not sure that you probably can. That being said, again, anything that's going to keep a high supply unit on the table is always going to be an excellent thing. It could also completely undo the hard work that your enemy has thrown at it, right? Depending on how well you're rolling on saves and stuff like that. If they started chipping you down in there like, okay, I think this next unit's going to be able to polish you off, and then you activate it, and then you heal. And now they're like, oh no, I'm going to have to throw multiple more units at this, which is going to tie up my units from getting to other objectives. Even if the Goliath goes down again, right? Something we were talking about earlier. Even if the Goliath goes down, as long as it bought you enough time, you might win the game, right? And if it's buying you time so the opponents have to soak up so many resources over here that they cannot stop and keep you from taking an objective over here, that could cost them the game, right? And Factory is going an awful long way to help you in doing that because it's going to increase the number of hits on average that they need to do to about 2 to 4 extra hits, depending on whether they're a damage 1 or damage 2 unit. And obviously, technically depends on how much surge do they have, other things like that. But it's going to be somewhere around 2 to 4 hits that you've basically canceled out by use of this. And every single turn, that Goliath can redo this as long as it activates early enough to not be destroyed, which is extremely hard to do in the movement phase. So, in my mind, I think this is phenomenal. It's fantastic. It's actually exactly everything that Goliath wants. Goliaths are perfectly fine on offense, all things considered. What it needs is to stay on the table. And while Tough 1 could be the same as Heal 2, it could be the same as Heal 1, right? Depending on the damage output that the hit that you're turning into a miss is actually going to be. And of course, you might just do really well in armor saves, right? Whereas Heal 2 is reactionary. It's dealing with, not in the fact that it's actually a reaction, right? It's an active ability that you'd use on the following turn. But what it means is that you can look and say, okay, has this Goliath actually suffered wounds? Yes, well, then I'm just going to fix that, right? And make sure that I'm keeping this at bay. And what I've discovered is if you are running multiple Goliaths, there's a very good chance that if you have multiple factories, your opponent's going to look at those Goliaths and they're going to say to several of them, it's just not worth it to try to work these things down. I'm going to work down other Goliaths, and other units first because I can actually remove firepower that way more reliably, and then I'll try to chunk through the rest of it later. And so the result is the factory actually has a chilling effect on hits as well, especially if you have multiples of these, because while you can't use multiple factories, I don't think, on a single turn, what it does indicate is it says, hey, wherever you're choosing to do damage, whether you're doing it on this guy, even if I choose to heal this one that you've been working on, don't consider switching to another one because I'm just going to heal that up as well, right? And so it ironically helps to keep your Goliaths even more safe than just the heal 2 that it provides, because it encourages them to take an honest look at the board and say, would I be better off shooting at other things first? And then between medics and cover saves, giving you evade and things like that, and anything that you can do to help you out in slowing down the loss of those units is just going to help to maintain the firepower you're getting from Goliaths even longer. Because once they've committed against certain units, they feel like they kind of have to continue working them down until they're inefficient or until they're completely gone. And all of that, I think, is helpful for Goliaths. But this is not enough to get you to number 1, in my mind. And number 1 may be a little weird because you're going to tell yourself it isn't always necessary. But I'm here to tell you it has won an awful lot of games for me. It still helps you with fielding everything you would want. And more than that, and this I think is what's really key here, is it's going to double down on one of the best things the Goliath can have to free you up to win in other parts of the battlefield. And that is the supply depot. Okay? Now, supply depot was probably the most broken upgrade when the game first came into beta. And it was one of the first tactical cards that got adjusted. Okay? But this one, first of all, it does give you an elite slot, which is really nice, right? So it's helping us be able to field stuff. But it has a very simple ability. It's active in the movement phase. The active unit supply value is improved by 1 for controlling and contesting mission markers and completing objectives. This is insane. Because when you consider how close to an objective marker you have to be in order to score for it, having to get more than 3 supply for any army within range of an objective when you have an 80mm base that is taking up some of that space is insanely hard. It's insanely hard. It's especially hard if that unit doesn't want to get into close combat, right? If it's a unit like a unit of roaches that is not a corpse or roach unit, they would much rather be shooting their acid bile than they would be trying to attack with their claws. They are dramatically better with that, even against Goliaths, which they don't surge against. But how many of these units are you going to have to try to finagle and fit so that one tiny model is within range? It is extremely hard to do. And it is even harder to do if that Goliath unit isn't just barely clipping the range, if it just tries to aggressively sit on the objective marker, basically, on account of the fact that you had a place token from something like a dropship, for example, and then it just says, oh, and by the way, I'm supply 3 for this turn. That is crazy. That is probably going to be the Goliath's objective for a very, very, very long time. And so the result is it's going to just absorb a whole lot of aggro. They're going to have to devote a lot of stuff to try to push that Goliath off, right? Because otherwise, Goliath is just going to be ranking in points, and that could be the game right there, right? And if you can do this late enough in the turn, where you've activated a bunch of other stuff, you made them think about other emergencies. They're activating things in other places. They've already started devoting assets, so they only have X amount of supply near this thing, and so maybe they've got 2 and you've got 2, and then late in the turn you drop the supply depot and say, well, actually, I'm not 2. I'm actually 3. They may not even have assets to move over to try to contest that. That could be the match, right? Especially if you then end up pounding away at the unit that's over there and they now drop from 2 supply to 1 supply as their base, because now it means you don't have to drop the supply depot over there. You're still winning. So now you're forcing them to send stuff over there, but then if they do send stuff over there, you just drop the supply depot on them again. And now they got to send even more stuff over. Or, ugh, I threw over all this stuff here. We're trying to get rid of this Goliath. It's taking forever and a year because he's healing him with a factory and because it's already hard enough to get rid of as it is. We can't reduce his supply at all until he blows up. And we're still going to be coughing up points this turn. This is one of the most frustrating things you can possibly do in an opponent is dropping supply depot on a Goliath. This is one of the most difficult things. It would be improved if it also helped you with disengaging. It would make it so you could get away from zealots and large zergling squads and things like that a whole lot easier. Down the line, it would especially be particularly useful because we don't know what the Ultralisk supply is going to look like, but any little bit helps, right? So toward that end, I mean, in my mind, it's still really good. In my opinion, it's number one because while healing is fantastic, there are some situations where you're not going to need to use it on a Goliath because the opponent's going to say it's just not worth it to try to throw my shots at this. But being able to say, okay, well, you do actually need to take advantage. You actually have to throw your attacks against the Goliath. You have to do something with this guy, otherwise he's going to win the game for me. That on its own is phenomenally good, right? Even more so if you have other Goliaths in the near vicinity and they don't know which one you're going to drop it on. And so multiple objectives are in danger, and you get to then pick which one down the line they couldn't reinforce quite enough. You might end up picking up multiple objectives because they were trying to split their forces a little too thin, right? And if you know that you're going to be able to pound really hard against one of those because maybe you're going to target lock against a unit, you're going to use a pinpoint style machine gun so you can even gun into another combat with one of their attacks. You know that you're going to be able to crack armor really, really well with haywire missiles or whatever it is that you want to do. Like there's a lot of stuff that just comes from the fact of, hey, we're going to make you work harder to try to get past our Goliaths. And that even assumes the Goliaths alone, right? If you have another supply 1 unit that's nearby that's also contributing, it just gets harder and harder and harder to actually remove these things. Core coming down to the fact that the Goliath itself is going to be hard to remove, so they aren't really realistically going to be able to monkey with your supply by the end of the round. Now, there's one more thing we have to talk about now that we've talked about this, which is the fact that, again, this video might become outdated very, very soon. Because I think we're going to see some extra cards that are going to help mechanical units, and they're likely to replace it. And the reason for that is because we know what the proxy barracks and the tech lab barracks look like. And you can take a tech lab on a factory, and you can proxy a factory. And those are total things that Terran strategies have done for an awful long time. And in my opinion, we could easily see copies of these with some changes present for the Terran factories as well. And so a proxy factory, if it's pretty similar where it's just giving the heal 2 mechanic in place of go, 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 and it's giving, kind of a similar bonus to armed and ready where you get to deploy off of an enemy entry edge, which is kind of what the proxy ones all do, that could be extremely useful because the only thing better than a dropship that takes you out of the match for an entire turn by placing down a token and then you come on at the end of the round so you can't do anything on that round. The only thing better than that is being able to walk onto the board at the start of a round and you didn't miss a beat, right? At the very start of turn one, as round one is beginning and we've got our first movement phase, you end up dropping down a Goliath on a far-flung objective that your opponent thought was pretty safe. It was supposed to be the one that was far away from you. It's supposed to be the one they're supposed to have control of. And now a 2 supply, possibly if you have a supply depot, 3 supply unit is on their home objective. Well, that's problematic, right? And then the fact that you can still heal it because you can still run a normal factory alongside whatever that proxy factory is means you can actually keep it in the fight for a longer period of time, right? You can still maintain it, and now suddenly you've got the opponent on the back foot, especially if they are not proxying themselves. A tech lab factory could also be really nice. It might be something like anti-evade. It could also be something like an additional move action, right? And the reason why I'm thinking about this is, especially if it ends up dropping with the siege tank, one of the things that could be really good is assuming that you have to deploy into siege mode in the movement phase, which is what I would do as a requirement, being able to move and then go into siege mode could be a really, really useful tool. And so I could see a tech lab being the way of doing that, right? Relatively efficiently. It could still be something like anti-evade. I don't think it's going to be something like critical hit because I think they don't want to make it the same as the armory. And I don't think it's going to be something like tough. Certainly not going to be something like dodge. I don't think it's going to be anything defensive. I think it's going to be something offensive that's going to come out of the tech lab. And honestly, I'm here for that. That's totally fine by me. But just suffice it to say, if something like that comes up when siege tanks are released, I think they're going to make the top 5. Right. It's nothing personal against Orbital Command. And it's possible that Dropship just drops off because maybe Dropship isn't all that useful for mechanical if we were able to proxy. Right. And so toward that end, we will be looking into potentially re-reviewing this video in the future because we might have to. But what do you think? Do you think that I ranked, say, the Armory far too low? Do you think that it's obvious that the heal 2 off of the factory, not to mention the fact that it's allowing you to field more Goliaths, is enough to push it over the supply depot? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.